The Voting Rights Act of 1965. What is it? The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a piece of federal legislation that barred discrimination in voting. It was signed on by President Lyndon B. Johnson with the aim to restore the right to vote to African American males that southern states like Georgia, Alabama, and Florida had taken away from them because of their racist ideals. Why was it necessary? It was necessary because from the 1800s to 1960s, black African American males had been barred from voting by Southern legislation. This legislation was put in place in order to protect those states' political leaders. If blacks were allowed to vote during these times, the racist political leaders would have been voted out very quickly because of the opposing values. Southern lawmakers put in place literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause in order to bar African American males from voting. Literacy test and poll taxes barred blacks from voting because most blacks were often illiterate or very poor. The grandfather clause also prevented blacks from voting because most blacks' grandfathers were not allowed to vote. Blacks were also barred from voting because of their community. Often, if blacks attempted to register to vote, they were often harassed, intimidated, and threatened with death by racist members in their community. There were also violent backlash from groups such as the infamous KKK, which would often do anything to prevent blacks from having the rights that they rightfully deserve. An example of these racist white communities is veteran Medgar Evers. Evers was a veteran of World War II, and when he and other black ex-servicemen attempted to vote, a white mob had stopped them with harassment and threats of death. Evers was found saying, "We fought the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though the white Mississippians would." However, blacks did not stand idly by in the face of this injustice. Blacks protested in events like the Selma to Montgomery March. This march took place in Alabama and went on for 3 days as the blacks marched the Selma route of 54 miles to Alabama's state capital of Montgomery to register as many black voters as possible. The entire time, the protesters were harassed by racist whites and other groups. Another major protest for civil rights was the March on Washington. In this march, over 250,000 protesters marched to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Here, MLK and his followers listened as MLK recites his "I Have a Dream" speech. This speech was a speech focusing on removing racism from America and fighting for blacks' civil rights. Because of these protests, acts such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were able to pass through legislation, and because these were then passed through federal legislation, it allowed for blacks to sue states and get their rights back. An example of this would be South Carolina v. Katzenbach, where Katzenbach was able to sue the state of South Carolina because of their test to deny citizens the right to vote. Because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was able to be passed through federal legislation, it immediately saw an increase in black voters. This added 250,000 new voters. These voters were then able to vote for government leaders who were more keen to vote for their rights, as they were now representing the people who had been previously oppressed, thus making the system more equal. In conclusion, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a monumental piece of federal legislation that restored civil rights to black Americans who had been oppressed before, as they were not allowed to vote for their governmental leaders.